Listen, it's a pleasure and an honor to welcome you all here. I'm Hitesh Hathi. I'm with the Mittal Institute. It's really an honor to have such an extraordinary collection of people for what I know will be an extraordinary event. I don't want to take too much of your time. I want to just briefly acknowledge Rahul and his colleagues and my colleagues at the Mittal Institute who worked very, very hard to put this together. And this is the culmination of many, many years of work on Rahul's part. So rather than me telling you more about what's to come today and over the next days, I just want to briefly introduce Rahul. All of you know him, so I won't give you a formal introduction with his many, many accomplishments. I want to say that Rahul and I have known each other for more decades than I can count, since the 90s when we were at Harvard. And he was always the one that everyone turned to as the much, much smarter one. And he's remained so all these years with original work, original scholarship, and original architecture. And it's one of the privileges of the job I have is to, in fact, work with Rahul so closely and collaboratively, as he has been doing some groundbreaking work and bringing South Asia together as a community and connecting it to the world and the world to it. So without further ado, let Rahul tell you what's coming. Thank you all for joining us.
Hitesh, that wasn't necessary, but thank you very much. And Devashree and Pranav, please come. So, I want to start by welcoming you all and for taking the trouble to be here with your time and that generosity, and we're really in debt and appreciation. This is Pranav, Thole, and Devashree Shah. They are absolute collaborators in this process because, sorry, I'm actually hearing my own echo. Yeah. So is there something you need to fix? Thank you, sorry. Yeah, so they are absolute collaborators on this process, and they were students at the GSD at Harvard, graduated a year ago, and have had the interest, passion, and the stamina to stay engaged right through this process. And everything we've done here, we've co-curated, including the book that we are going to share with you. So we look forward really to these next days of, I hope, critical discussion about a range of issues that clearly cross national boundaries and hopefully propel us towards, I believe, more ecological thinking, in that we work with the idea of our interconnectedness, whether it's forms of dwelling in South Asia, the nature of our settlements, or even the opportunities for livelihoods and cultural production more generally. In South Asia, the multiplicity of cultural, economic, social, technological factors is fueling a significant transition. I mean, the world is in transition, but here it's propelled by the scale of our population, but also these changing issues, rapid urbanization, shifting demographies, the explosive population growth, which is reshaping the social and cultural landscape, not to say also, of course, the political. And these transitions bring forth a multitude of issues, including inequity, poverty, economic disparity, and the impending climate emergency. And so by addressing these transitions, architects, we believe, can create architecture that not only adapts to the evolving context, but also contributes to positive social transformation. In fact, architects are in the front line of space making, clearly. The question then is, how can architects define their constituencies beyond their immediate clients to address a gamut of issues that are intrinsically tied to any interventions they make? That is how every intervention also considers the betterment of those involved, not just the client, but rather the expanded imagination of the client as the patron, the community, and by extension, the locality, and perhaps even more. And so it's issues like this that have propelled us to think about a conference such as the one that we are going to collectively engage with over the next 3 days. And so also, as our cities expand, socioeconomic disparities, they continue to grow, questions of infrastructure, the issues related to the marginalized, underprivileged populations. I mean, these are all obvious, these vulnerabilities that we sense. But the question really is, how, as professionals, specifically architects, do we begin to pick up these questions, redefine them, address them, intervene, perhaps act? And so with the present generation, I think what has been very interesting as part of this research, we find responses to be multifaceted. And one can witness through this engagement, and part of the exhibition and the book that we're going to release shows you this, that through engagement with sites of conflict, with remote and underrepresented communities, and with frameworks for affordable housing and a multitude of other issues, I think there is an emergent generation as part of this transition that is imagining new forms of infrastructure, of public spaces in cities, and forms of engagement. And so this emergent generation is committed to the simultaneous validity of the modes of engagement, as well as transgressions and synergies between disparate disciplinary cultures, modes of representation, knowledge accumulation, as well as production. Of course, it means walking the razor-thin line between the often polarized imaginaries of time that informs the making of architecture and its usefulness in perpetuity, versus imagining it as a transitionary process and purpose even. And so this imagined binary requires unsettling and challenging the relevance of the static, of the permanent manifestations of architecture as the singular spectacle or organizing instrument of the city. And it implies a simultaneous embracing of seemingly disparate practices, and like I said, knowledge systems as well as protocols that emerge from these differing ways of engaging with the world at large. And so how one actually engages with these processes and this notion of transition productively is a real challenge. And what comes out of it are many models of practice, different ways that you can actually engage and act. And we believe, or at least I believe, I shouldn't draw everyone into this commitment, but in the research this is emerging, that the hegemony of the business as usual forms of practice which find themselves in pedagogy are actually coming in the way of us beginning to affect the built environment in a meaningful way. And so therefore, to recognize what these different models would be that are existing on the ground could provide rich feedbacks within these varying cultural contexts, and a kind of democratization of design through multiple facets of engagement. And perhaps that could lead to a more inclusive and empathetic form of practice. And so this project on the state of architecture in South Asia and its thematic thrust of imagining the architectures of transition seeks to inquire about what the practice of architecture is in the region and what it means for the next generation. It attempts to surface the questions and challenges for the future that could inform pedagogical priorities in the academy in the region. Education and professional protocols that are codified by institutions for architecture must grow out of these discussions and not be constrained by them. And I think that has been a take. And so we don't have a session on education or on Council of Architecture protocols, while that was a suggestion many people made for this reason. We believe this is the feedback that a conversation like this can provide. And I think their protocol should be premised on what we see, I hope, happening on the ground. And so it really is a series of questions really that emerge. How do we move away of the gaze of the megacities? For architectural pedagogy, how do we shift the precedents of the masters and the early modernist legacies in each country in the region to new precedents that might be more relevant locally? What scales should these precedents be at, and to make them meaningful? What are the emergent forms of technology being employed, and what is its potential impact on the South Asian context? What might be the new material cultures and those of making that we could potentially embrace? What does practice mean for women architects in South Asia? The ratio of women studying architecture has gradually increased over the years, or dramatically increased over the years. However, the conversion to practicing women architects has been much slower. The socio-cultural and political climate of many South Asian countries is a major hindrance to the growth of women architects in the profession. And how are women practitioners breaking socio-cultural barriers and carving a space for themselves within the profession? So how do we define the mainstream of practice, and what are the points of intervention that might affect the shifts necessary? And how do we construct a more nuanced, complicated reading of the context? Is it solely constructed out of reading of climate and culture? How might we be more rigorous in our reading of the context as well of the context it sits in? How do we read the context of the context? And so when we make this, or when we sort of articulate this notion of transitions and make it central to this argument, the temporal scale becomes critical. How do we embed time in our imaginations of the future form of architecture? And this has implications of how we imagine the life cycles of buildings, of materials, the relevance of programs in time. That is not lock resources for permanent solutions, or more often transitionary or temporal problems and requirements. And this is something, these are areas I believe we haven't spoken enough about. And more critically, how can this be taught and communicated as well as advocated for in the public realm is a critical question in imagining the role of the architect for the future, and that really is the intent of this project. And now what I'll do is very quickly outline the components of the project, and the intent here is to really share with you where we are in this process. And these are some of the components. We started off actually during the pandemic with a virtual lecture series, which actually led us to be really motivated and excited about carrying this on. So this is one way that we have broken the different components of the project. And the lecture series led to a book, but it also led to us thinking about a conference like this. And Devashree and Pranav will, right after I finish this sort of these components, share with us some of those findings. And this research, when we were looking at young practices, we looked at patronage, methodologies, emerging technologies, which really has informed the structure in a way of this conference. And then from that came a traveling exhibition, the exhibition that you see. And the intent of this exhibition, it may be a bit ambitious, but we hope with your collaboration and help, we can make it happen, is to travel to different countries in South Asia, where in every location, a local curator would be brought on board that can add to it, because we have looked at it from the outside, and if we've missed young practices that are doing significant work, this would be a way of adding on. And so that really is the intent of the exhibition, and we hope we can pull it off. And this conference then becomes the component that we embark on at the moment, and I hope we can take this to a conclusion. The intents here are to bridge the academy and practice. The idea is to structure and formulate modes of practice differently and have a conversation around that. With that, I'm going to very quickly ask Pranav and Devashree to share some of the findings, and then we'll move on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Rahul. Over the next few slides, Devashree and I will take you through the process and the research for the publication, Architectures of Transition, Emergent Practices in South Asia. When we began this project, we realized there are very few forums within South Asia where architects within the region can speak to each other, recognizing the shared yet distinct cultural and in the region. We saw the need for an institutional conference. Like Rahul mentioned earlier, we started with a virtual lecture series at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and invited 24 young practices within their first decade of practice, focusing only on projects in the public. The hope here was to foster an ecology of practitioners and create a network of peers, encouraging cross-pollination of ideas, concepts, methods, but also to provide a resource for young architects like us. The publication emerged from this lecture series. Both these components, the lecture series and the publication, serve as instruments to get a pulse on the ground in the region. The aim better understand not just the opportunities present, but also the issues that the current and emerging practitioners are grappling with. Finally, the publication catalogs 41 emergent architectural practices in South Asia that display rigorous engagement in the making of architecture, landscape, and infrastructure in the public realm. It also includes reflections from scholars, a contextual framing essay, a graphic taxonomy of plans and building types, documenting most prevalent public commissions among younger practitioners, and infographics based on a survey of the practices featured in the book, offering us some insights into the emerging trends. Here is a map of the geographical location of all the practices included in the publication. Our assumption at the onset of the project was that the role of the architect in shaping the public realm is incredibly absent in the region, And thus, this research began an exploration of how, as a profession, we can reclaim this role. This criteria guided our selection of practices, intending to trigger a broader dialogue about the agency of architecture in the public domain. The emphasis on the younger generation or young architects is intentional. Their perspectives and emerging methodologies often offer innovative solutions to age old challenges. Their endeavors mirror the state of the architecture in South Asia today, its evolving dynamics, embodying its aspirations, challenges, and hopes. Keeping this in mind, we included practices that are led by practitioners around the age of 40, roughly about a decade in the field. We made a rigorous effort to have adequate representation from all countries. However, as you can see, the representation is slightly skewed. There are a lot more practices from India and Bangladesh. It was also a challenge to identify younger practices from the Maldives. This imbalance can perhaps be attributed to the different stages of economic growth, types of patronage, and political conditions that vary between the countries within the region. The stage of development among the different practices was also uneven, some having built more than the others. And finally, challenges in achieving a balanced gender representation became evident, particularly due to our focus on practitioners below 40 years. The mapping of the project locations shows a lower concentration in the central parts of India and an obvious predominance of projects in mega cities across South Asia, pointing to the disparities in the distribution of public projects and also access to patronage. A glimpse of the book. To identify some patterns of practice in the region, we conducted a survey that inquired about the models of practice for the firms featured in this publication. Through this survey, we wanted to gain a clearer idea of the range of the projects these practices had undertaken, understand their organizational structures, and forms of patronage they work with. Even though the sample size of the survey is limited to the 41 young practices from South Asia, we think it offers a valuable understanding of the current trends in the region.
We map the transition to practice for each principal architect. The magenta spokes in the graphic represent the years taken post a bachelor's degree to set up practice, while the orange represents the years taken post a master's degree. We observe the principals transition swiftly into practice post their education, with almost percent of them establishing their firms within 5 years of completing their architectural studies. The diagram on the left speaks to the size of the practices and groups them based on the number of employees. Most firms are small to medium sized, with 50% of them falling in the category of 5 to 20 employees, with only 5 firms that had employees in the range of 20 to 50. On the right, looking at the demographics, it is evident that the workforce in these firms is predominantly young, with individuals aged between 20 to 30 making up 62% of the workforce, and those between 30 to 40 adding up to only 29%. There's also a growing trend towards gender inclusivity. 50% of the practices had a balanced male-female workforce, and about 10% declared the inclusion of non-binary individuals. To understand the range of projects and the domains they fell within, for each practice, we depicted the relative distribution of the collective portfolio of the firm across different domains such as institutions, private residence, community initiatives, repair, conservation, interior design, and allied design services. It was obvious that private residences dominated the type of projects that were being commissioned, with a striking 80% of practices working largely on single-family houses. In comparison, only 30% of the practices were actively involved in community initiatives, advocacy, repair, and conservation. This also points to the disparity in public versus private projects, and reflecting the shift, we observed that a significant 65% of the practices expanded into allied design services such as exhibition, product, furniture, and graphic design. We were curious to map different types of patronage, such as private, corporate, institutional, public, private development, the state, civil society, and NGOs that enable these 72 projects featured in this book. We also correlated these forms of patronage to the project's budget and the project's area. Through this, it was clear that the projects supported by institutions, civil societies, and NGOs often lean towards a mid-sized budget ranging from 10,000 US dollars to 30,000, with a completion rate pointing to their limited resources. It's also worth noting that 15 out of 72 projects had a budget under 10,000 US dollars and were completed within a year, hinting at expedited budget conscious undertakings such as repair work and community based interventions, which are often addressed with some urgency. During this research, we observed a few larger trends in South Asia. As Rahul previously mentioned, through our interactions with the practices, we witnessed an increase in engagement with sites of conflict. They initiated community interactions and went to remote and underrepresented communities for initiation of projects. They imagined new forms of infrastructure and created patronage for them. These issues were not always in the primary focus range of architects in the preceding generations, but now the expectations from the younger generation of architects to be responsible and responsive to these issues has multiplied. In response to these transitions in South Asia, we also witness an evolution in the models of practice to engage and adapt to the region's unique challenges. One few examples are the cross-subsidy model is becoming increasingly common, where the architects collaborate with developers and commercial projects to ensure that their community-driven endeavors are feasible in an attempt to balance between the economics of practice and the commitment to social good. Many architectural practices are also gravitating towards non-traditional organization structures. Instead of the architect being the sole author, they are positioning the makers, collaborators, and a range of specialists as invaluable partners and giving them much more agency in the design process. There's also been a surge in community outreach initiatives where the architects are acting more as facilitators, creatively employing communication tools that are sensitive to a wide range of users. As young architects starting out, it was inspiring for us to see and observe these patterns, and we hope that this democratization of design through multiple facets will lead to a more inclusive built environment.
Thank you, guys. And so, just to end, I think learning from this research is what really informed the conference and its structure, because we felt that what we were hearing from the ground, they were practitioners who were older than 40 years, who had been practicing for 20 years, were working in this way, but it wasn't visible that kind of articulation of a practice model. And there wasn't enough discussion on it, partly because we have a very limited press and media on architecture in India or in South Asia. Our next speaker, Kaiwan Mehta, is going to share with us his experiences, because he was one who really almost for a decade shepherded an effort in this direction. And so therefore, what the West consumes is a very particular kind of practice, which sometimes has no relevance with the majority in terms of the pulse on the ground. And so the learnings from this research project of young practices in the book, it leads to this conference, which tries to then build on that structure to see if we can draw other experiences of all of you who are going to participate in the next 2 days to give direction to what might be ways we can articulate forms of practice. And so that's really how these themes that you've seen as part of the program have sort of evolved. And the next two components of this afternoon, before we move to the keynote, which will be at 6 o'clock, we'll have a tea break just before that, is we're going to have two components. One is we invited Kaiwan Mehta, who used to edit Domus. He's an academic and a researcher, and many other things. But as we, the QR codes have on your brochures have all the bios. We are not going to be elaborating on people's bios. You should discover them. And the second component that we are going to have is we're going to have the moderators for each of these sessions come up and speak for 5 to 10 minutes about their interpretation of these sessions. So you begin to get, as an audience, a sense of what we are trying to frame collectively within these themes and what you might expect to hear. And the moderator sharing that is also a provocation for the speakers who they've been in touch with, so you can sleep over new thoughts that might emerge through those provocations. So let's move on, and thank you guys for this. Kaiwan, if you could come and share your thoughts with us, and then we'll move to the moderators. Thank you.
Good evening, Rahul. Thank you very much. And thank you to the entire team of this project and conference for having all of us here. The slide presentation or the images are going to be more supportive to what I'm speaking this afternoon, this evening. And they are also a reminder of a history that we've had with two exhibitions, which have in a sense been the trigger for where we have come today as the state of architecture in South Asia today. And in between, there are some reflections that pop up in terms of the editorial pages of, and what may pop up as a few editorial pages in between this presentation, which were also some of the preoccupations that one has had in the past decade as an editor, as a curator. So good evening. It's my pleasure and privilege to present this lecture and address this afternoon at the onset of this wonderfully curated 3-day conference. The theme for this conference emerges in a conversation between three of us: Rahul Mehrotra, who is also the principal curator of this conference and project that we are gathered here to deliberate over, the cultural theorist and curator Ranjit Hoskote, and myself in 2012, when I was running a small space for critical thinking in the field of architecture practice and studies called Arbor in Mumbai, and had just been appointed as the editor of the India edition of the much revered Domus magazine. And Rahul at that time had just published his critical book on architecture in India since 1990. The conversation between the three of us in 2012 and the ensuing 10 years of collaborations and discussions is not to be only seen in the perspective of three concerned critics and researchers developing a project, but these 10 years of developing continuous exhibition and publication projects is much more a map and an ongoing writing, rewriting project of the shifting ground beneath our feet. Every generation may feel that it stands at a moment of change and historical shifts. But we have enough reason and thesis to believe that we truly are standing at shifting crossroads over the last 20 years. And our critical endeavors as curators has been the struggle to figure out what will be the shape of the future. Where are we headed? How do we make sense of the present? Why is the present so elusive? And why are we falling short of models of understanding and explanation? We clearly were not ready to give up in any sense of nostalgia. We were neither ready to give up on the future as some sort of a doomed chaos, and we were not ready to accept the present in platitudes or jingoism or in despair and complaint. Especially as an editor, or for that matter, for Ranjit Hoskote as a curator, especially the curator of India's first official pavilion at the Venice Biennale, or for a constant chronicler of the built world histories such as Rahul Mehrotra, we knew it was our job to make sense of the present and accept that if we are unable to make sense of it directly, There is much more a problem with our models of thinking and knowing rather than the present, or rather than only with the present. The indication was clear. The existing models of knowing our profession, our practice, our world was falling or crumbling, and without throwing them out in some new world or shining times jingoism, we had to reconfigure and maybe even discover and innovate newer models. The three of us coming together itself was a clear indication that our three independent practices, our generational differences, needed to speak with each other to discuss the present, ever changing into the future. Was this only a need to know the future? Obviously not. It was rather a question of what does our practice and the wider field of architecture hold for the future? And can our practice intervene critically and productively towards a future that is sure going to celebrate the towering and the iconic? And how would we make meaningful transitions that are thoughtful and set parameters of ethics and culture, history, and ideas? The exhibition was not a trophy we celebrated as curators. It was, in fact, an active research that we created as a repository and archive of propositions and negotiations for the practices and profession to freely draw from. At this juncture, let me sort of take a cue and that a lot of my conversation comes from the position of being in India, being the editor of a magazine that looked at India or the state of architecture, which looked at practices and protocols in India. But I think for all three of us as curators, I think there was a larger sense of what are the geographical and political axes that are shifting in the world. And even if we spoke from the position of India, there were many other geographies, whether it was questions of Abu Dhabi and Dubai, or whether it was conversations between Dhaka, Colombo, Karachi, that were on our mind. So, in many senses, the exhibition, as much as it looked at India, there was a sense of how we were sort of looking at India within a wider sort of shift of geopolitics. I also have this slide to begin with, which was actually between the two main exhibitions, the state of architecture and the state of housing, which I will elaborate on soon. And this came soon after the demolition of the Pragati Maidan building in this city. And I think some of the conversations that we were trying to have between the two exhibitions came up really sort of sharply at the demolition of this building. It was not simply the question of the demolition, but it was also the question of how the profession and how a nation responded, or rather did not respond to a demolition. So the question of how we have been dealing with demolitions in the last 30 years is equally a question as much as to how do we build buildings in the last 30 years. So, in a sense, this question that one has been talking about is the question of how do you make sense or how do you calibrate the contemporary? Notice it. Do I just. Okay. Yeah. And dealing with a landscape that is constantly sort of shifting ground between the familiar and the unfamiliar. So there are things that are familiar, there are things that are unfamiliar, and we are still producing within that landscape. And the question becomes is that how do forms of practice become fields of action? Does architecture matter? One of the key questions, which I will elaborate again, that emerged in the exhibition, The State of Architecture. The exhibition, as I said, was not a trophy we celebrated as curators. It was, in fact, an active research that we created as a repository, an archive of propositions and negotiations for the practices and the profession to freely draw from. We had to draw out a chronology, one that was not merely by the debate between colonialism versus loss of history, or new nation building versus rediscovering the past, or the later debates between post colonial positions and shifting trust from the state to the community. We had transited all these models of making sense of our 20th century. The debate between recovery from the West and developing indigenous models was taken care of already in the 80s. In fact, the 90s did this boringly and only driven by ideology, while the 80s did this more academically. Besides an annotated chronology, we had to create a kaleidoscope of the present. To stand in the present and review the present, as our interlocutor, the architecture historian Mustansir Dalvi, titled his interview with the curators, we were now without the benefit of hindsight. Our tryst with destiny had in fact just begun to unfold in the 1990s, and context began to take newer meanings besides the overused structures of regionalism or the vernacular, which continued an Orientalist overview in the name of an Indian or Asianness. Pride or random discovery of the past was creating more political turmoil than any resolution of our tryst with destiny. Using the colonial as the other of being indigenous was, in fact, the new tool for throwing out cosmopolitanism or the ethics of modernity. Architecture, by nature of its form and structure, is visuality and representation, as diagrams of space and metaphors of culture and civilization did play overt as well as unheard roles. Architecture was contributing to a wider experience of the built popular, the visual world all around us. From Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children to Amitav Ghosh's The Hungry Tide, we were in the throes of asking again who we are. But we were in a rush for answers and emblems without the patience of a Gandhi or Tagore, without wanting to take the arduous journey of Nehru's rediscovery of India. The world was suddenly interested in Dubai and Mumbai and Dhaka and Shanghai, perceptively reading the geopolitical shifts, yet it did not give space to rethink models of politics or history, besides narrating rational theories of economics or space, or you became an emblem of new order of networks and flows, flows of capital and useful knowledge or skill banks. It is no surprise that some of the new models of viewing our locations and context came from the active role played by city studies from the 1990 onwards. The city studies model was perceptive of the tryst and the ticking time bomb we were sitting on. The nature of the market and new networks allowed the arts to also become the site of reading the world with renewed positionalities. From the parts of Africa to East Europe, West Asia, or South Asia, a global readability that we had from our colonial education allowed us to project local readings in the new emerging global flows of money and minds. The colonized locations could read Roland Barthes and Rabindranath Tagore or Walter Benjamin and Bhimrao Ambedkar with nearly equal ease. Was the rhetoric it's India's time or it's Asia's calling true? Or was it history and economics, both at a particular juncture, that pushed us to locate world and Asia, the home and the world, from Tagore again, in non-binary and non-directional exchanges? An urban researcher from Mumbai could make a critical commentary on Abu Dhabi's urban development at the Venice Biennale, working with a French curator. This line may seem as some celebration of globalization. No, it's not that. It is in fact indicating what negotiations of knowledge production and flows of capital we were in fact negotiating at the turn of the century, often taking this for granted as the future. But this was just a precarious moment of transitions. In all this, at the face of it, architecture was also becoming flows of technology, economy, and imagery. And somewhere in our education systems, we continued to rely on notions of ethics in nostalgia or ideas of regionalism that could be dangerously nationalist, rather than contributing to robust imaginations of the nation or the region beyond watertight imaginations of cultural particulars and political boundaries. However, as an editor, one had learned to look and look for, and there was trust in practices of negotiations rather than practices of celebration or confirmation. Mehrotra's Architecture in India since 1990, after Bombay Cities Within, or my entry into Domus after writing Alice in Bhuleshwar, or Ranjit's earlier collection of poems in Vanishing Acts to curating the question, where is India? Or stating carefully, we know something is about to explode. That was the title of his Venice Biennale curatorial position. Through bringing conversations between works of art, asked and searched to find where does meaning lie? Or does meaningfulness lie in the practices that shape the world and the way the world thinks? As historian, as editor, and curator, our practices convey hope in rereading architectural ideas and manifestations, but also in allowing ourselves to learn from younger work that was produced more intuitively and through thoughtful responses with care and curiosity, and that allowed us to propose new frameworks as much as that body of work had to be brought into newer critical conversations. The images that you're seeing was the final gallery in the four-tiered National Gallery of Modern Art in Bombay, which was actually looking at the last 20 years in that exhibition. The State of Architecture exhibition and project are research which was constantly shaping our curation, our discussions that were allowing us to detail and edit the exhibition as an exhaustive, yet sharp commentary on the practice and profession brought us to many theses and questions. But the one question that emerged as one of the primary importance and requiring urgent attention and thinking and action was the role of the architect. What is the role of the architect and how does it unfold in practice and in engaging with the contemporary? Is the architect an active engager, if not the key player of the yesteryears? Or is the architect a handmaiden to her or his times? The context then is actually an active agent of shaping the contemporary. The context is not the background or setting for the architect, but the architect is in fact understanding and then at least making an effort to redraw the context or intervene to engage. And this is one of the reasons that if we began the State of Architecture exhibition with a 3-day conference on the state of the profession, we closed the 3-month-long State of Architecture exhibition with windows and mirrors, which was actually expanding this conversation to the state of South Asia, to the state of architecture in South Asia, which becomes the thematic for this stage of this project. And in fact, in between, we had a week-long festival of young practitioners from India. So in a sense, the entire exhibition was also punctuated with these conversation platforms. The other primary and crucial issue the curators thought was important to address head-on was the architect's social engagement on the architect's essential role to engage with public, than simply act as a celebrity designer or stylist for ultra-private homes. As much as single-family homes or residential interior design occupies much of the work in many studios and offices, this decision to keep single-family homes out of the exhibition totally was important, and some of the country's most celebrated architects had no representation in the exhibition. This was one of the most debated issues amongst many young architects and students. It was these questions and discussions that took us to the second phase of this research through another exhibition project where we focused on the state of housing in India. From home to housing, housing was one typology or one area of practice that demanded various levels of engagement from the architect. Engaging people and community, engaging policy and governance, engaging with bureaucracy and economics, engaging with the question of rights and citizenship, and yes, engaging all this as a designer, as a planner, and the scope and limitations of the profession. The exhibition engaged with a history of political engagement with housing and homelessness equally as much as it did with design and design processes within a practice, a profession, and the cultural sphere of housing. The questions had to be deepened for architecture, and these two exhibitions did that. It was also necessary to revert to the architectural object, no longer to see it as a self-contained object, monument, icon, but as an object in the landscape, shaping object and context in a constant jugalbandi. And so the question of architecture and the role of the architect presents itself in the forefront. The exhibitions and the work between research and writing, or being an editor or a cultural organizer, one reflected constantly on the state of being of the field and its practice. One responded to the need before the lack. The profession needed active reviewing and critical thinking. Any profession will need it at all times so that it can be challenged and it also gets hints for directions to move on. However, there will be times in history when the role of the critic and the theorist will be paramount and essential. And the decades of the 1990s through the first decades of the 2000s, it has been that time. And in India, the energy was high, but active and robust architectural criticism lacked sorely. I say this not simply as a regular complaint or quip, but I wish to note this historically and say it descriptively and clearly. Often, with a growing economy, the tentacles of the profession may expand into areas of allied work, such as writing and journalism, curating and research, but often this happens without much professionalism or education invested in these feeder practices. A growing profession with a dynamic and shifting ground will essentially need criticism and research to keep a live system of critical thinking through reflection and shared or open review processes, such as the 3 days that we have here. However, these would need to be seen as independent practices with their own protocols of training and action, and practices that believe in a research turn and practices that believe in a research turn, intellectual turn for actual architectural practice will need to invest in setting up the protocols of such a practice within its unfolding. The lack of more than one good magazine or well thought through discursive and public forums or critically edited print or digital media that sustain a public review and debate processes for the profession has been a running concern. In the absence of discourse, it is only bulking the expanding professional shift, but in no way. So what I mean is that media only does a jingoism of the bulking nature of the profession as it grows with economic growth, but in no way contributing to its critical growth or deepening the substance of practice or knowledge in general. Practice in the region has been rich and going through rapid transformations. This is evident in the experiments and the work with a wide range of building materials in more ways than every brick wants to be an arch kind of rational approach. Meaning making and playing in a garden of symbols, images, visual narrations, simultaneous with questions of cost and context, being open to debate and new processes, reinterpretations of building typologies, as well as the emergence of new typologies and processes of approaching beauty or meaning or location and context, and then pending emergencies of our time, climate, and history. Projects have been articulating architectural thinking, the intellectual life of architecture through their projects, which is what the lecture series during the pandemic that Rahul and his team mentioned as well. It is required that this quantum and wide range of work is curated and calibrated to make sense of our times. As architects, as citizens, as residents and travelers of this earth, we always make sense of architecture by looking at the world around us and the landscape of ideas floating around architecture. The question is, can we make sense of the world through the life of architecture and design? It is in fact necessary for architecture to contribute through its practice and protocols to the wider intellectual life of our own times. In return, architecture will know where it matters and what ground of action it holds. The design process as the site of action and public imagination. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kaiwan. Thanks a lot for getting us going and using the two exhibitions to really resonate many of the issues that really the conference is interested in. So really appreciate that very much.